This is a Solid Signal podcast for the week of January 6, 2020. This week, of course, is the CES show in Las Vegas. Don't call it the Consumer Electronics Show anymore because CES doesn't stand for anything. CES just stands for CES. CES used to be put on by the Consumer Electronics Association, and it was known as the Consumer Electronics Show. Now that it's put on by a different group called the Consumer Technology Association, it just doesn't stand for anything. So, because CES does not stand for Consumer Electronics Show, does that mean that everything there has to be consumer electronics? It seems like more and more what we're seeing at the CES show are not traditional consumer electronics. Remember, CES, through most of its history, was a show that was first about audio equipment and televisions and small computers, and in the last 15 years or so has increasingly been about larger televisions and sort of dream appliances. And less about what we would call gadgets, because gadgets and consumer electronics, that's kind of the goal of what you want to see in this show, right? And yet, every year CES is less and less about that. This year, I expect that the North Hall of CES to be one of the busiest spots to see. There are going to be a lot of different cars shown, and the North Hall has gone from basically being audio equipment, which, by the way, is almost completely absent at CES now, to being all about cars. It's where we've seen high-profile releases of concept cars in the past, like the Faraday Future and the Byton and the Fisker. But this year, although there won't be as many new vehicles shown, expect to see a whole lot more going on in the North Hall having to do with automotive stuff. And in the South Hall, which has traditionally been the more gadget-oriented hall, expect to see more and more releases. I was looking at a list of exhibitors, and they include things like John Deere and the people who make the Impossible Burger. In fact, the Impossible Burger was probably the hit of the show last year, and it's food. You can't say that food is a gadget. I mean, it's engineered food, and I gotta say, in my opinion, tastes pretty darn good for apparently a salad and a bun. But the point is, it's not a gadget. And should CES be nothing but a gadget show? And if it's nothing but a gadget show, should it eventually fade away? I don't know. But that's the real question. CES has tried to expand into new forms of technology. Obviously, food and cars and broadcast media and measurement and services, and they have all sorts of innovation prizes and awards and programs for people from all over the world to try to create new stuff. Honestly, though it does dilute the focus of the show a little bit, I think it's actually a good thing. CES, the real CES, takes place behind the scenes. Folks, I'm in those meetings, and I'll tell you that CES, as you see it on your local television broadcast and as it's reported in blogs like Engadget, that's not the real show. The real show are people sitting down to talk about what they're going to be buying for the following year. Companies like SolidSignal.com rely on shows like CES to connect them with manufacturers from all over the world. That's the part of CES that's important. The rest of it it's just marketing. And there's nothing wrong with marketing, but giving a little bit of flash and panache to whatever it is that you want to promote, I think that's okay. And I think it's also okay to realize that pretty much everything that we crave in our modern life is in some way some level of consumer electronics. I mean, there's very little out there that doesn't have some sort of computerization anymore. I mean, heck, your average remote control has more computing power than the average Defense Department computer had 50 years ago. There's an immense amount of computing power out there, and anything that's got that kind of logic in it is consumer electronics. It's just that simple. So, yes, I think that all of it does belong there. And you're going to see more and more media coverage of stuff like burgers and tractors and robots and healthcare stuff and all this weird stuff, and cars. and less, I think, of real kind of hardware. And that's because the hardware is not the important thing anymore. It's what you do with it. We don't really care so much about showing PCs, and there are other shows for PCs, and also we don't necessarily care about that. There are shows for phones too, but really those tend to be captive events. When Apple wants to to show off a new phone, they hold an event. When Samsung wants to show off a new phone, they hold an event. Same with Google and Motorola and all those other companies. Now, this is just more about the sizzle and the flash and the excitement. That's why you have gigantic companies showing these gigantic booths in Central Hall. At this point, it's an advertising expense. It's not a sales issue. The real sales, as I say, take place in closed rooms. Those deals are the things that are actually going to bring you great products for the rest of the year. And that's the part of CES that I very rarely get to report on because all that stuff is confidential. Every year, the team over at Solid Signal picks up all sorts of things that you don't even see at solidsignal.com for months to come because we're still developing it. We're getting approvals to bring stuff in from overseas. It's a very complex process. In the meantime, you do have all this great coverage of the show to kind of make yourself feel good. The television that rolls down from the ceiling, or the self-driving cars, or the whatever. That stuff, that's a lot of fun. And I think that it's okay that the CES show has evolved into doing that and not just being about gadgets. It's all part of growth. It's all part of change. And I don't think that anybody who went to the 1980 CES would recognize it today. Certainly nobody who went to the 1970 CES would. And that's just fine. Folks, this is 2020. This is the future. And if you want to know what the future is going to look like, well, take a look at the CES show. Read all the great reporting at the Solid Signal blog, blog.solidsignal.com. Look for the tag CES 2020 and learn all about the kind of stuff, the kind of reporting that you won't find at some of the major outlets. Every year, the blog team goes to CES and tries to bring you a different perspective. We don't have a bus. We don't have 100 reporters. And so we try to bring you stories that are a little bit off the beaten track. It's kind of a lot of fun for us, and I hope it's a lot of fun for you. Meantime, one last bit of business. Please, if you haven't yet, subscribe to the Solid Signal podcast if you watch on YouTube. Subscribe if you're on Spreaker or any of the podcast aggregators. Because, honestly, we're going to just try to bring you the best podcasts every week. Just by the fact that you subscribe does not mean that you have to listen to it. It just kind of gives you a little bit of extra benefit knowing that something else is out. That's it for the podcast this week, and we'll be back in the offices next week after CES is concluded. Until then, have a great one.